I'm Amanda Miller with the BC chapter of the Society for Range Management, and welcome to the fourth in our webinar series. So today, Tim Ross is going to be speaking to us. So Tim Ross of Ross Range and Reclamation Services has been a member of the Society for Range Management since 1984. He fell in love with the range after being accepted for a postgraduate degree at the University of British Columbia with a field project located in the Williams Lake, BC area. After working for Range with the BC Forest Service in 100 Mile House, he moved to the Cranbrook area in southeastern BC, and one contract led to another, and he continues to work in Range throughout BC and Alberta. So a couple of housekeeping items before we roll into the presentation. Down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a mute button and a stop video button. And there's also a chat and Q&A button in the middle as well if you wanted to drop any questions in there. So today, Tim's going to be talking to us about range fertilization in the Rocky Mountain Trench. So Tim, please take it away.
Thank you very much. I must say it's a pleasure to be involved in this session, and many thanks to Amanda for hosting, and Amanda and Haley and Sarah for putting it all together. I like the informality of it, and thanks to all of you folks for coming out to listen to this. It's way too nice a day here in the East Kootenay to be sitting inside, but this is important too. So range fertilization in the Rocky Mountain Trench, the project was designed to investigate the efficacy of range fertilization to increase forage production, forage quality, and improve range condition on grasslands in the grassland, ponderosa pine, and interior Douglas fir biogeozones. So the reason we wanted to do this is forest ingrowth and encroachment continue to reduce the size of the grazable area in many pastures. ER treatments have been touted as a long-term solution to the problem, but in the short term, we need increases in forage production, forage quality, and range condition. Now, we had quite a few objectives. The first was to determine the soil nutrient profile on native grassland, determine the effect of fertilizer treatment on forage production and forage quality, and we were targeting increased bunchgrass cover and frequency, and we would like to increase herbaceous species richness. But what we don't want to encourage is establishment in grasslands by invasive plant species, and that in my mind also includes ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. And finally, we want to collect long-term data on the efficacy of range fertilization treatment. Now, we worked in cooperation with Pine Butte Ranch, which you can see there in the center of your center left of your square. So the issue is twofold. One is keeping cattle on the range at the end of the season, and the second is trying to prevent or reduce elk depredation on the ranch's private land, hayfields, and pastures. So we had 5 sites in 4 different pastures, and our pre-treatment monitoring described existing plant communities, and we established control and treated areas at each site. We took soil samples in 2017 and developed a fertilizer blend to correct for soil nutrient deficiencies. And fertilizer treatment was applied in June 2019. Now, some of these sites were looking pretty tough when we started out. This is the Artesian site, and it's one of those sites that elk use, cattle use, deer use, and people use a lot. There's always a camp there. There's always ATVs driving around. So we were trying to do what we could to help these places out. So we did it the old-fashioned way with a farm tractor and a spreader that you rent, and we just put it on the way you would do anything else. So we had 2 different blends. The first was predominantly nitrogen with sulfur, and it went on 4 of the sites. And the second blend had nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur, and it was applied just at the one site, Indian Springs North. Now, what we did for monitoring was basically we established permanent transects, we put out grazing cages, we had treated and non-treated areas, and then we monitored plant community composition, and we established the range condition, and we also did forage production. The best sites were found at Deep Springs and Indian Springs North. Blue bunch wheatgrass, Idaho fescue, and rough fescue were the dominant bunch grasses. The artesian and sheep camp sites were poorer condition. They were dominated by needle and thread, prairie June grass, Sandberg's bluegrass. Now, as I mentioned earlier, as well as being important grazing sites for the ranch, there's a elk herd of 300 to 500 head that winters in the forested areas right around the ranch and right adjacent to all these sites. So they've been subjected to varying levels of grazing intensity over the years. Now, baseline data was collected in 2018. We found that plant cover ranged between 26% at artesian to about 40% at Deep Springs and Indian Springs. Total grass cover was pretty low at artesian and sheep camp, between 10 and 13%, and it was about double at Deep Springs and Indian Springs North. Now, the baseline forage production ranged between 150 kilos per hectare at sheep camp and about 480 at Indian Springs. Now, results were collected in 2019 and 2020. So we found that total cover was higher at all treated sites except for Indian Springs North. Grass cover was higher at all treated and control sites in 2020 compared to 18. Forward cover was more variable. Now, the frequency of bunch grasses increased from about 73% to nearly 100% between 2018 and 2020. And bunch grass cover increased from about 10% to more than 25%, showing a significant year effect. And this is Indian Springs in 2018, and that's Indian Springs in 2019, 1 year following their fertilizer treatment. Now, needle and thread was the only bunch grass to show a significant fertilizer effect, but its cover more than doubled between 2018 and 2020. And prairie June grass also showed a significant year effect, also more than doubling in cover. And our other grasses, which were everything that wasn't a bunch grass, also showed a significant year effect. Now, this is the sheep camp site, sheep camp 1 in 2018. Now, we found that there was no significant differences in bunch grass production between the control and treated areas in either 2019 or 2020. And happily, there was no difference in invasive forb production between treated and control areas. The good part of the story is other grasses production was nearly 70% higher in 2019 and more than double in 2020. What we found was forage use was approximately 50% when averaged across all sites in 2019, and it was about 40% when averaged over all sites in 2020. So it is very likely that the fertilized areas attracted grazing animals, because what we found was basically we had grazing animals on all sites all year in the treatment year. Some fencing issues and recreational vehicle issues made that possible. And that's the fun of doing research in the real world at field scale level. Now this is sheep camp the year after fertilizer treatment. Although it was one of the poorest sites, it actually had the best response as far as forage production goes and litter production and carryover. Now, one of the other topics that was pretty interesting to us was forage quality, because we took samples of bunch grasses, other grasses, and forbs in 2018, and then we resampled in 2019. We found that nitrogen content was 0.96%, 1.36, and 0.9 for bunch grasses, other grasses, and forbs respectively, pre-treatment. And then post-treatment, we found that nitrogen levels went from 1.7 to 2.1 and 2.2 for bunch grasses, other grasses, and forbs respectively in 2019. And bear in mind that diet requirements for a mature beef cow are approximately 0.87%. So these data indicate that crude protein levels were between 10 and 13%, which is a great improvement, I believe, especially when maintenance level for a beef cow is about 9%. We also found that the calcium phosphorus ratio is adequate for ungulates, and post-treatment potassium levels exceeded maintenance levels for bunch grasses, other grasses, and forbs. Now, also of interest is the economics of the whole thing. So we fertilized about 56 hectares or 126 acres. The total cost of the fertilizer, the transport, and application was slightly less than $9,600. Now, as I mentioned earlier, our pre-production forage or pre-treatment forage production was about 150 to 480 kilograms per hectare. So we pretty much tripled our actual production. Now, the cost for those increases varied quite significantly between sites. If you look at the second column on the right-hand side, you can see that the cost per ton ranged between $9.63 and $55.97. And the cost per AUM from $2.44 to $14.22. So you have to ask yourself, is this treatment economic? If you just looked at the numbers, you might say no, but are there other benefits? And you'd have to say yes, because we had improvements in bunch grass cover and frequency. We had no invasive species issues. Actually, we had one invasive species issue that was very interesting. Cheatgrass really responded to the fertilizer, especially the nitrogen, but it responded so well that every little patch of it was eaten right to the dirt because it was so sweet for the animals, is what I figured. So the palatability was so high that they ate it all, and there was no seed production. Gotta like that. And we definitely increased forage quality. And I think the other important tool is this can be used to impact distribution of livestock and wildlife. Because as I mentioned earlier, we found that we had definitely attracted animals to these sites. So if you thought about a site that wasn't getting the sort of use you wanted, you could potentially fertilize the site. Now, the final issue that only did that once. The final issue was, did we influence elk numbers at Pine Butte Ranch? Our baseline data wasn't very complete, but what we see here is that numbers are very similar in March and April. But in the second year of monitoring post-treatment, May and June numbers were quite a bit decreased from May and June in 2019. So that's not really conclusive, but I think it shows the right direction. I know that the ranch was happy. They said there was less elk on the ranch into the growing season. So I'd like to acknowledge at this point our funders, the Cattle Industry Development Council, the Grassland and Rangeland Enhancement Program, and the Investment Agriculture Fund. And I'd be glad to take any questions anyone might have.
Wonderful. Thank you for the presentation, Tim. That's really interesting work. I've not seen much fertilizing on native rangeland systems. So I will read out some questions that we have in the box for you that you can answer.
Sure.
So Tom Platt says, what was the form of nitrogen in the mix? And please clarify when it was applied.
It was applied between June 6th and June 12th. And you would say ordinarily that would be a bad thing, because typically we are starting to get our late spring, early summer rainfall by that point. I would like to have had it on in April, but we were having permitting issues because we're dealing with Crown land. So when we got the permits, we put the fertilizer on, and it was just standard quick release nitrogen, just a basic fertilizer blend.
Perfect. And then Nicole Presley asks, what other factors may have led to the reduced elk numbers? I know you said it isn't conclusive, but wondering about the bigger picture.
Well, distribution, that's a whole new topic. Like we could go on all afternoon, but typically elk are mostly on the ranches early in spring, right at green up time. And then they will stay there as long as the range is coming along. Once the range has greened up sufficiently, they typically move along. And then the other part of it is, when do they return to depredate private land hayfields and pastures? And typically it's this time in the fall. Elk season ends tomorrow, so the day after that there will be elk everywhere. Put it that way.
Okay, thank you. And then another question is, how often would you have to reapply fertilizer?
Well, we did detect fertilizer effect in the second year after. The literature says, and there isn't much, but a lot of work was done in the 80s, and the range that was talked about was like 3 to 10 years of continued fertilizer effect. It depended on the site. The drier the site, the longer the fertilizer effect was possible.
That makes sense. Was there any baseline soil information taken to indicate that nutrient levels were low?
Oh yeah, we soil tested. I didn't talk about any of that stuff just because it's a short discussion, but the most important deficiencies were nitrogen and sulfur. Okay. So that's why we predominantly addressed those, and at one site we also added phosphorus.
Perfect. What were the other grasses that increased at the Sheep Camp 1 site? You said it was not bunch grasses, and just wondering what the other grasses were.
Typically it'd be Kentucky bluegrass, Canada bluegrass. Occasionally there'd be a domestic like smooth brome grass that'd be on these sites. Crested wheat, because some of them had some seeding done back in the 50s. So for discussion, I just lumped them all together.
Makes sense. And then also, can you say more about how the IAG responded to the fertilizer?
Which, sorry?
IAG? I'm not sure exactly what that means. Oh, invasive annual grasses. Okay, sorry. The question was, can you say more about how the invasive annual grasses responded to the fertilizer?
We got weed jargon going on here.
Yeah.
Cheatgrass was the only grass that we recorded on these sites for an invasive annual. And as I was saying anecdotally earlier, it liked the nitrogen and responded to it very well, but the animals sought it out because it was extremely palatable. you know, how soft it is in the very first stages of the spring. Well, it was not only soft, but it was also about half a foot high. So it was, every little patch was grazed. That was wonderful.
Okay. So are there any other questions? Right.
I have a quick question. It's Wendy. I just was wondering, Tim, because you said at the sheep campsite that Kentucky bluegrass increased, and I know I've seen with biosolids trials that they did in grasslands the same thing. Would you be concerned? Do you think that's leading to an increase in the cover of that species? Is that, I know the site is fairly problematic, so I mean, I guess there's give and take, but how do you feel about that change? Because it's still a non-native species.
Well, you know, Wendy, I consider that the bluegrasses they're here. They're naturalized, or whatever word you want to use. I didn't think it was a bad thing because the balance pretty much stayed the same between the needle and thread and the bluegrasses. And because we've got grazing animals out there, the bluegrasses are very palatable, so they got used. So in the bigger picture, I think production is good, and there is basically more production per site. And if it comes from Kentucky bluegrass, which is already there and not going anywhere, then you got to say you're making the best of a non-ideal situation.
Very true. I have a question for you, Tim. These were quite dry sites that you applied the fertilizer treatment on. Would you recommend it for moister sites, more mesic sites?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Really, a couple of the sites were just very, very shallow to very rocky subsoil, and they responded well. I can tell you that I had about a ton of fertilizer left over, and I brought it home to my place and put it on where it's irrigated, and there was orchard grass taller than my head, and I'm 6'3", and it's a much more mesic site over here. I would also add that we're deep in a 5-year drought here, so rainfall was about 60% of the normal for the growing season in our 2 post-treatment monitoring years. So it's quite likely that that deficiency in rainfall masked the actual fertilizer results somewhat.
Very true. All right, well, thank you for the presentation. Tim, very, very interesting work that you have going on here. And I see we don't have any more questions. So I would like to say thank you to everyone who attended today, and please check us out next week as well. Next Wednesday, we will be having a presentation by Dr. David Eduardo Prado Tarango from Oregon State University, talking about the response of rangeland plant species to different sources of mycorrhizal inoculum. And we look forward to seeing everyone there. Oh, and Wendy also says the PNW meeting is for the Pacific Northwest section of the Society for Range Management, has their meeting starting at 1:30 Pacific Standard Time today. And check out the Pacific Northwest section's website if you want any more information, and to find recordings of these presentations on YouTube. All right, thank you, everybody.
And one more thing, just a little plug for our chapter t-shirts, of which I'm wearing one. I don't know if you can see the back there.
Yes.
So when we all get together again, we will have them available at the next summer and spring tours, fall tours. Exactly. Okay, thank you again, folks. It was a pleasure to do this.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a great rest of the day.